The silence of midnight was broken by the deafening crack of a gunshot, and in an instant my entire world collapsed as pain ripped through my leg and I fell to the cold marble floor of my bedroom, blood spreading fast beneath me, my hands trembling as I struggled to understand what had just happened. And then my eyes lifted toward the figure holding the gun, and my heart shattered into pieces so small they could never be put back together again because it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't some nameless thief, it was my son. My only son, the boy I had raised alone with love and sacrifice, standing there with panic and greed burning in his eyes as smoke curled from the weapon in his hand. And around him, his friends, masked and reckless, stormed into my sanctuary, tearing through my drawers, yanking open cabinets, snatching jewelry and cash like vultures feeding on a carcass, while I laid helpless, bleeding, betrayed, unable to comprehend how the child I once held against my chest could now be the very person who wanted me dead for money. And in that moment, every corner of my house, every luxury item I had worked a lifetime to earn, became nothing more than evidence of the greed that had poisoned his soul. I tried to speak, to reach him with the voice of his mother, whispering his name with all the strength I could muster. But he only shouted back at me, his voice breaking as he barked at his friends to hurry, to take everything before the neighbors heard. And the sound of drawers slamming and glass shattering filled the room like thunder, drowning out my pleas, my tears, my very heartbeat. As I gritted my teeth against the searing pain, I realized that if I survived this night, if God allowed me one more chance to breathe, I would never forgive this betrayal, not from strangers and not from my own blood. My name is Patricia Carter. I am 71 years old, and I was once a proud doctor who spent decades healing others, saving lives, and building wealth brick by brick with sweat and sleepless nights, believing it would protect my family and give my son the future he deserved. But tonight, I am not here to talk about medicine, nor about success, nor about the sacrifices of my past. I am here to tell you how my only son raised a gun against me, how he tried to rob not only my possessions, but my very life, and how I turned his betrayal into a story of revenge and justice that no courtroom will ever forget. And if you are listening to this right now, I want you to do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and write in the comments where you are listening from, because your support helps me share these stories, and maybe, just maybe, it will help another mother, another grandmother who feels alone in her suffering to realize that betrayal can happen to anyone, but justice, when fought for, is always possible. I was not born into wealth. And that is something I will never let anyone forget, because every stone of the mansion I live in, every polished surface, every chandelier, every drop of comfort came from my hands, my mind, and my sacrifices. Not from inheritance, not from luck, but from the relentless discipline of a woman who swore to herself that she would rise above the poverty she came from. And that determination shaped my entire life, pulling me from small beginnings into the long nights of medical school, where I studied under dim lights while others slept, stitching wounds in emergency rooms before the ink had even dried on my degree, working back-to-back shifts that broke my body but sharpened my skill, until finally I became the respected doctor people turn to when life hung by a thread. And over the years, I built a reputation, then a career, and eventually an empire of security and wealth, all while raising my son as a single mother, because his father, a man who once swore love to me, decided that responsibility was too heavy a burden and walked out when Michael was still in diapers, leaving me to pick up the pieces and carry both the stethoscope and the cradle alone. And I did it without complaint, because when I looked at my son, I saw not abandonment, but a reason to keep fighting. There were nights when I returned home so exhausted that my legs trembled and my hands shook, but I still carried him in my arms, still read him bedtime stories, even when my throat was raw from calling codes at the hospital, still kissed his forehead with a smile, even when tears burned behind my eyes from sheer fatigue, because I told myself that all of it, the long hours, the sleepless nights, the missed meals, would mean something if it gave him a better life, a life I never had. And slowly, it did. Promotions came, then opportunities to invest, and with each smart choice I made, the foundation of my wealth grew stronger. Until one day I looked up and realized I no longer worried about bills or rent. I had properties, cars, travel opportunities, and finally the freedom to enjoy the fruit of decades of labor. But that freedom came with a cost, one I did not see until it was too late. While I was busy providing everything, I was blind to the fact that my son was learning nothing about earning, nothing about gratitude, nothing about patience. He was learning only that his mother's love was measured in money, that every problem could be solved by reaching into my pocket, that sacrifices were invisible if they ended with a gift in his hands. And though I raised him in luxury, I failed to raise him in humility. Michael grew up in a house where the pantry was always full, where holidays meant mountains of presents, where vacations meant first-class flights and ocean view resorts, and where his mother, despite her exhaustion, never let him see the cold reality of how hard life could be. Because I thought protecting him meant sheltering him, and now I realize that shelter became a cage, one that trapped him in entitlement instead of freedom. Even when he was a boy, I noticed little signs. The way he threw tantrums if he didn't get the latest toy, the way he boasted to his friends about things he did not buy, the way he looked at other people with a kind of disdain, as if he was better simply because of what he owned. And though I scolded him, though I tried to teach him values, I was always softer than I should have been, because deep down I was afraid of losing his love, afraid that if I was too strict, he would resent me, and in that fear, I spoiled him more than I should have. As he grew older, that hunger for more became sharper, darker, more dangerous. And by the time he was a teenager, I was already paying off debts from reckless behavior, covering up mistakes, smoothing paths that he never tried to walk on his own. And I told myself, like so many mothers do, that it was just a phase, that he would mature, that one day he would see all I had done for him and repay me with respect. But the years passed, and that day never came. Instead, with every dollar I gave him, his appetite grew. And while I dreamed of him following in my footsteps, maybe studying medicine or building something of his own, he dreamed only of faster cars, louder nights, and crowds of shallow friends who clapped when he spent money recklessly and vanished when it was dawn. I can still remember the day I paid for his first sports car, how his eyes lit up and he hugged me so tightly, I thought maybe, just maybe, he finally understood my love. But within weeks, he had crashed it, and when I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "It's just money, Mom, you can buy another." That sentence was a knife in my chest because it was not just money. It was my years of labor, my sacrifices, my dreams poured into something I wanted to share with him, and he reduced it to nothing more than paper. From that moment on, I began to see the cracks more clearly, the manipulations in his words, the way he would guilt me, saying, "If you really loved me, you'd help me," whenever I hesitated to hand over more cash. And I gave in, again and again, because he was my only son, my only family, and I was terrified of losing him, not realizing that I was losing him anyway, piece by piece, to greed. My friends warned me. My colleagues shook their heads. They said I was creating a monster. But love makes fools of even the wisest. And I refused to believe my son could truly turn against me. I thought the mansion, the wealth, the cars, the vacations, all of it would someday make me proud of him, would make him want to honor me. I never imagined it would make him want to kill me. And yet the night I saw that gun in his hand, I realized that everything I had built for him had been twisted into the very weapon he used to destroy me. The first time I truly understood the depth of my son's greed was not when he asked me for money, because he had been doing that all his life, but when I realized he no longer saw me as his mother at all, but as a bottomless fountain of wealth. a walking wallet whose only role was to fund his desires, and the realization came slowly, like cracks spreading across glass, invisible at first, but impossible to ignore once the light hit them. And I remember sitting across from him in the grand dining room of my mansion, the chandelier casting warm light on his face, and seeing not a boy who had grown into a man, but a man-child who refused to stand on his own feet, his eyes constantly flicking to his phone, waiting for messages from friends who only cared about his ability to spend, not about his heart. And when he finally looked at me, his expression was not one of affection, but of impatience, as if I were an obstacle between him and the life he wanted. He asked me for $20,000 that evening, his tone casual, as if he were asking for a glass of water, and when I asked him what for, he smirked and said it was none of my business, that he was an adult, that I should trust him. But I knew from the smell of alcohol on his clothes and the faint trace of perfume that clung to him like smoke that the money would vanish into bars, clubs, and the arms of women who saw him as nothing more than a generous fool. And my heart ached because I wanted so desperately to believe there was still goodness in him, still the boy I had once read bedtime stories to. But all I saw was greed, hunger, and emptiness. As the months rolled on, his requests became demands, and his demands became threats cloaked in guilt, and he learned to twist my love into a weapon, telling me, if you don't help me, I'll have no one, or what kind of mother lets her son struggle when she has millions in the bank? And though I knew deep down these were manipulations, I gave in more often than I should have because guilt is a powerful leash and he knew how to pull it tight. I bought him cars, each one more expensive than the last, and each one wrecked or abandoned within months. I paid off debts to shady men whose names I dared not ask, debts he had accumulated through gambling and reckless bets. I even bailed him out of jail once after he was caught in a drunken fight outside a nightclub. And though he promised me with tears in his eyes that he had learned his lesson, that he would change, that he would do better, the promise lasted less than a week before he was back in the same cycle, begging, wasting, destroying. And I felt myself unraveling with each lie, each broken vow, each time I looked into his eyes and saw nothing of myself, nothing of the values I had tried to teach him, only the reflection of greed staring back. I remember one night I caught him sneaking into my study, rifling through my desk drawers like a common thief, and when I confronted him, he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Relax, Mom. I know you've got more than enough. You won't miss a few thousand." As if my life's work, the years of sweat and sacrifice, were nothing more than spared change to be taken without thought or gratitude. And that was the moment I realized that greed had not just infected him, it had consumed him, body and soul, until nothing else remained. The friends he surrounded himself with were vultures in human skin, men with tattoos snaking up their arms, women who saw him as a ticket to champagne and designer handbags. And though I warned him, begged him to see the truth, he refused because the truth would mean facing the emptiness inside himself, and it was easier to drown that emptiness in noise and flashing lights. I tried to cut him off once, tried to hold firm and say no, to force him to stand on his own, and the rage that exploded from him still echoes in my ears. He screamed at me, cursed me, told me I was a terrible mother, told me that all of my wealth was worthless if I didn't give it to him. And when he slammed the door behind him, I sat there trembling, not just from fear, but from grief, because I realized that I had raised not a son, but a man who saw me only as a bank to be drained dry. And yet, even after all that, even after the insults, the betrayal, the reckless spending, I still found myself forgiving him, still hoping, still waiting for the day he would wake up and remember who he was. And that hope kept me prisoner to his greed, chained by love that was not returned, until the night came when he decided that even my willingness to give was not enough, that he wanted it all, and he wanted it fast. And so he turned not just to manipulation, not just to guilt, but to violence. And the boy I had once cradled in my arms became the man who raised a gun against me. Despite everything, despite the sleepless nights of worry, the broken promises, the shouting matches, and the bitter taste of disappointment that lingered on my tongue more often than joy, I could not fully let go of the hope that my son might change. Because a mother's heart clings to hope, even when reason begs her to surrender it. And so, in the quiet corners of my mind, I began planning something that I thought might reach him. Something that might remind him that love was not about money, but about sacrifice. Something that might bring us closer again. And that plan was a gift. A luxury car that I had been saving for in secret, not because I couldn't afford it outright, but because I wanted the gesture to be deliberate. A symbol of love rather than just another indulgence tossed his way. I had begun setting aside cash, withdrawing it in careful amounts, stacking it away in envelopes hidden in places only I knew, because I wanted to hand him that car not with a bank transfer or a credit card swipe, but with the weight of sacrifice he could feel in his hands, with proof that his mother thought of him even when he believed otherwise. I imagined the moment 100 times in my head. His birthday morning, the keys in a velvet box, the gleam of metal under a silk cover in the driveway, his expression transforming from surprise to gratitude, maybe even a tear or two, as he realized that no matter how far he had strayed, I still believed in him, still wanted to give him the best. And for a while, that vision kept me alive, kept me sane, made the nights of loneliness easier to bear. But life has a cruel sense of irony, because what I intended as a bridge became the very spark that set fire to everything. Somehow, Michael discovered the stash of cash, perhaps by accident, perhaps by snooping, or perhaps because his friends, the vultures he called brothers, encouraged him to search for what more he could take from me. And once he knew it existed, he couldn't wait, couldn't imagine patience, couldn't imagine gratitude. He could only imagine how quickly he might spend it, how many nights he could waste in clubs, how many bottles he could pop, how many hollow smiles he could buy from people who didn't care if he lived or died. I noticed small changes around the house in those days. The way he asked oddly specific questions about my routine, when I slept, when I left for errands, when the staff changed shifts. The way his eyes darted to my locked drawers when he thought I wasn't watching. And though I felt a pang of unease, I dismissed it, telling myself I was being paranoid, that he was my son, that even if he was greedy, even if he was reckless, he wouldn't cross that line. Not with me, not with his mother. I told myself that the cash was safe, that the surprise was safe, that the love behind it was stronger than the hunger gnawing at him. But deep down in the pit of my stomach, a storm was already forming. I remember one afternoon in particular when he came to visit, dressed in designer clothes I knew he hadn't bought with his own money, his cologne heavy, his smile forced, and he hugged me in that hurried way he had, a gesture performed out of habit rather than affection, and then he said, "You always know how to spoil people, Mom," in a tone that made my heart skip, because it didn't sound like gratitude, it sounded like calculation, like he was already counting what more I might give. And though I laughed it off, the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind late at night when I was alone. The cash began to feel heavier each day, not like a gift waiting to be given, but like bait waiting to be stolen. And still, I clung to my dream. Still, I refused to believe the truth that was staring me in the face. If I had listened to that instinct, if I had confronted him, perhaps none of what followed would have happened. But love makes fools of even the strongest, and so I kept saving, kept hiding, kept dreaming, even as the shadows of betrayal thickened around me. Later, when I pieced everything together, when I lay in the hospital bed replaying every moment, I realized that he must have already been plotting, already whispering with his so-called friends, already planning how to cake what was not his. And the thought that he watched me, studied me, waited for me to fall asleep, waited for the right night to strike, all while I was planning a gift to show him love, still makes my chest ache with a pain no bullet could ever cause. Because it means that my son had crossed the point of no return long before the robbery itself, that he had chosen greed over blood, that he had decided a car handed to him freely was not enough when he could steal the world by force. And so, while I counted down the days until his birthday with secret excitement, he was counting down the days until he could rob me. And in that twisted symmetry lies the cruel irony of my life. A mother preparing to give and a son preparing to take, both believing the other was blind, both waiting for the night that would change everything, one dreaming of love, the other of greed. And when the night finally came, it was not candles or cake or laughter that filled my home, but gunfire, screams, and the shattering of every illusion I had left about the boy I once believed could be saved. The night it all came crashing down began like any other, quiet and uneventful, the kind of night where the stillness of the mansion felt almost suffocating, the ticking of the old grandfather clock echoing louder than it should. And I had stayed up later than usual, my reading glasses slipping down my nose as I flipped through medical journals, a habit I had never quite shaken, even years after retirement. And perhaps it was fate, or perhaps simply bad luck, that I was awake when I should have been asleep, because that was the very detail that changed everything. At first, I thought the sound I heard was just the creak of the old wood settling. But then came the whisper of footsteps. Too many, too deliberate, and the faint click of metal against metal. And before I could react, before I could even process the danger, my bedroom door was shoved open with brutal force, slamming against the wall so hard that the echo shot down the hallway like thunder. In that instant, 3 figures poured into my sanctuary, shadows under masks, and yet one of them, oh, I would know him anywhere. I would know those eyes, that posture, that hesitation masked by anger. It was my son, my Michael, my only child, standing there with a gun in his hand, his knuckles white as he gripped it, his friends swarming behind him with sacks ready to fill, their voices harsh, barking at each other to move quickly, to grab everything, to tear apart the home I had built with decades of sacrifice. My breath caught in my throat, and even as the reality screamed at me, some foolish part of me still hoped I was mistaken, still hoped that when he pulled down the mask, I would find a stranger, not my own flesh and blood. But then he looked at me, and for a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the truth in his eyes, the fear, the greed, the desperation, and my heart crumbled, because there was no denying it anymore. My son had come not to visit me, not to love me, but to rob me. My instinct was to reach for my phone, to call for help, to do something, anything. But the moment I moved, his eyes widened, his arm jerked, and the sound that followed will haunt me until my last breath. The gun exploded in his hands, the deafening crack splitting the night, and fire seared through my leg as the bullet tore into flesh and bone, sending me crashing to the floor with a scream I didn't recognize as my own. The marble cold beneath me slick now with blood, my glasses skidding away as I clawed at the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding, but the pain was overwhelming, like fire eating me alive. I looked up at him, at my son, expecting horror, expecting regret, expecting him to drop the weapon and rush to me. But instead, he stood frozen for a moment, then barked orders at his friends, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Hurry up, take everything, don't stop, just take it all." And in that moment, the final thread of denial snapped, because he didn't see me as his mother lying wounded on the floor. He saw me as an obstacle, a witness, a problem that his greed had nearly solved with a bullet. The men tore through my room, ripping drawers from dressers, throwing clothes and jewelry into bags, one of them yanking heirlooms from the wall that had hung for generations, another kicking open the safe I thought was hidden, laughing as he stuffed it full of cash. And through it all, I lay there helpless, tears streaming down my face, not just from pain, but from the unbearable weight of betrayal crushing my chest. And I whispered his name. "Michael, please,
over and over, hoping that somewhere inside him the boy I had raised still existed, the boy who used to cling to my hand when he was afraid, the boy who once looked at me with love. But he wouldn't look at me. He couldn't. And that hurt more than the wound in my leg, because it told me he had already buried me in his heart. My vision blurred from blood loss, and the sounds around me became muffled as if I were underwater. The laughter of his friends, the curses, the crashes, all distant, while in my mind memories flashed like lightning. His first steps, his graduation, the nights I held him close when he was sick, and each memory twisted into a knife as I compared them to the man before me now, shouting for more, demanding faster, cursing the hesitation of his accomplices. And when at last they had filled their bags, when the room looked as though a hurricane had torn through it, he glanced at me once more, just once, and I will never forget that look. Cold and hollow, a look that said I was no longer his mother, but just another victim of his hunger. Then they were gone, their footsteps pounding down the stairs, the front door slamming into the night, leaving me in a silence more deafening than any gunshot. A silence broken only by the ragged sound of my breathing, the drip of blood pooling around me, and the faint tick of the clock that had once marked the rhythms of peaceful nights, but now seemed to mock me with every second it counted. I dragged myself across the floor, every inch agony, my fingers clawing at the wood as I tried to reach the phone on the nightstand. And when I finally grasped it, my vision swam, the numbers blurring as I dialed for help, my voice a whisper as I begged the operator to send someone, anyone, before the darkness claimed me. And as I collapsed back, the phone slipping from my hand, I swore to myself, with every ounce of strength I had left, that if I survived this night, if I lived to see another sunrise, I would not let this betrayal go unanswered. I would not be silenced. I would not be broken, because the bullet had wounded my body, but it had awakened a fire in my soul that no one, even my son, could not extinguish. And justice, though it might be slow, would come, and when it did, it would take him down with all the weight of the law and the wrath of a mother betrayed. When I opened my eyes, the world was blinding white, the antiseptic scent sharp in my nose, and for a moment I thought perhaps death had claimed me, and I had awoken in some sterile afterlife. But then I heard the steady beep of a monitor, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the soft murmur of familiar voices. And I realized I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the very environment I had once commanded as a doctor, only this time I was not the healer, but the broken body being pieced back together. My leg was wrapped thick with bandages, an IV dripping life into my veins, and my head felt heavy with medication. But the moment clarity returned, the moment memory slammed back into me, I felt a fire surge through my veins stronger than morphine. Because the betrayal of my son replayed itself in my mind like a nightmare on loop. The gunshot, the cold look in his eyes, the sound of laughter as his friends robbed me while I bled, and the crushing silence when they were gone. And though the pain in my body was immense, it was nothing compared to the wound carved into my soul. Doctors came, colleagues I had once mentored, their faces pale with pity as they told me the bullet had missed the artery by millimeters, that I was lucky to be alive, that recovery would be slow, that walking might never feel the same. And I nodded, thanking them, but inside I thought, lucky? No, this is not luck. This is purpose. This survival is a gift, a chance to make this right. And as the days bled into nights under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, I began to shift from patient to planner, forcing my mind to stay sharp, to observe, to analyze, because if medicine had taught me anything, it was that details matter, that survival is in the precision, and I was going to survive not just to walk again, but to see justice done. I replayed every moment of the robbery, every face, every movement, every sound, cataloging them like symptoms of a disease, building a diagnosis of betrayal. I remembered the way Michael barked orders, the tremor in his voice, the tattoos peeking from beneath the sleeves of his friends, the duffel bag they carried, the items they stole, and the way he glanced at the safe as if he had known it was there all along. And with each memory, I felt the puzzle taking shape. My friends came to visit, their eyes wide with horror when I whispered the truth that it was my son who had shot me. And I could see in their faces the conflict, the disbelief, the unwillingness to accept that blood could turn on blood. But I did not waver, because I had seen it, lived it, survived it. Some urged me to forgive, to protect him, to keep the shame hidden. But I had made my vow that night on the floor, and I told them firmly, no one, not even my son, gets to take my life and walk free. And so I began to gather, to plan, to use every resource still at my disposal. Nurses whispered about suspicious pawn shop transactions that had appeared in the city days after the robbery, about jewelry too fine for common thieves suddenly flooding the underground market. And I listened, connecting dots. I called in favors from old colleagues in law enforcement, men whose wounds I had once stitched, women whose children I had once saved with a scalpel. And they agreed to help quietly, to look for signs, to trace money trails. I demanded access to the security cameras from my mansion, my voice still weak, but my will unbreakable. And when I finally saw the grainy footage, the shadowy figures storming into my home, I froze the screen on the one detail I needed, the shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the way he moved. Because a mother knows her child's body like she knows her own, and no mask in the world could hide him from me. I pressed my hand against the screen, tears burning, and whispered, Michael, you cannot run from me. I know you. Days turned into weeks, my body slowly healing, but my spirit sharpening like a blade. I practiced sitting up despite the pain, practiced walking with a crutch, even when doctors told me to rest, because I refused to remain weak, refused to let him believe he had broken me. Each step was agony, but each step was also defiance, a declaration that I would not be silenced, that the mother he thought was his victim was in fact his hunter. At night when the ward was quiet, I wrote notes, pages upon pages, documenting everything I remembered, names of his friends, times of his visits, the way he had asked about my routine before the robbery, and I built a case with the meticulousness of a surgeon preparing for an operation. I reached out to an old lawyer friend, a man who had once been a patient of mine after a heart scare, and when he saw me in that bed, frail but unyielding, he clasped my hand and said, Patricia, if what you're telling me is true, we will bury him in evidence. And I nodded, my jaw tight, because truth was all I had, and truth was enough. Slowly, the net began to close. Investigators traced the stolen jewelry to pawn shops linked to Michael's so-called friends, followed bank deposits that matched the amounts I had stashed, and uncovered surveillance footage of the gang spending lavishly days after the robbery. And each piece of evidence was a stitch in the wound of justice I was sewing shut. And though it broke me to see my son's face among criminals, to see his name listed in police files, I reminded myself of the bullet hole in my leg, of the blood on my floor, of the emptiness in his eyes when he pulled the trigger, and I knew this was no son of mine anymore, not the boy I had raised, but a man consumed by greed who had made his choice. The day I signed the statement against him, my hand trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of finality. Because it was the moment I severed the bond that had chained me for so long, the moment I declared to the world and to myself that love does not mean blind forgiveness, that motherhood does not mean martyrdom, that justice comes before blood when blood turns poisonous. And when the detectives promised me that charges would follow, that arrests were imminent, I leaned back against the pillows, pain radiating through my body, but a fierce calm settling in my chest. Because for the first time since the gunshot, I felt like I could breathe again. The bullet had not killed me. The betrayal had not ended me. I had risen, scarred but unbroken, and soon the world would know that Patricia Carter was not a victim, but a survivor, not a silent mother, but a woman who would drag even her own son into the light of justice.
The day of the trial dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning where the clouds sag low over the courthouse like a weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. And as the car carried me to the steps of justice, I stared out the window at the world rushing past, thinking of how many times I had driven through the city as a doctor, rushing to save lives, never imagining that one day I would be here to watch the law measure out punishment for the very life I had once given. And as the doors of the courtroom opened before me, the echo of my cane against the marble floor was sharp and deliberate, every step a reminder that, though my body was scarred, my will was stronger than ever. The air was thick with whispers, reporters scribbling notes, strangers craning their necks to glimpse the woman whose son had turned a mansion into a crime scene. And I held my head high, refusing to bow to shame, because shame belonged not to me, but to him. Then I saw him. Michael, my son, shackled at the wrists, dressed in the orange of the accused, and for a moment the room spun, because the boy I remembered, the boy who once clutched my hand crossing the street, who once laughed with a gap-toothed smile, was gone. And in his place stood a man hollowed out by greed, his face pale, his eyes darting desperately, searching the crowd until they landed on me. And when they did, his lips trembled, and I could see the tears forming even before he spoke. The judge called the room to order. The lawyers began their speeches. Evidence was presented. Photographs of the stolen jewelry, surveillance footage of the robbery, my own testimony read aloud in a voice steadier than I felt. But all of it blurred in my ears, background noise to the pounding of my heart, because I knew what was coming. The moment he would turn those pleading eyes on me, the moment he would try to claw his way back into my mercy. When at last he was given the chance to speak, he stood, chains clinking softly, and his voice cracked as he said, "Mom, please." I didn't mean it. I was scared. I was stupid. I was desperate. Please, forgive me. I'm your son. I'm all you have left. His words echoed through the courtroom, and a hush fell, every eye turning to me, waiting, because they all knew that this was the heart of the trial, not the evidence, not the legal arguments, but the question of whether a mother would condemn her own flesh and blood. And I felt the weight of generations pressing on me, the expectation that I would fold, that love would override justice, that I would trade my scar, my blood, my pain for some fleeting illusion of forgiveness. But I looked at him, really looked at him, and all I saw was the night of the robbery, the gun shaking in his hand, the bullet tearing through my leg, the way he barked at his friends to hurry instead of rushing to my side, the way he left me bleeding on the floor without a glance back. And in that moment, I knew there was nothing left to forgive, because forgiveness is for mistakes, for stumbles, for human flaws, not for attempted murder, not for betrayal so deep it carves through bone and blood alike. My hands tightened on the cane, my jaw clenched, and when the judge asked if I wished to respond, I rose slowly, my body screaming with pain, but my voice steady as iron. And I said, "Your Honor, I do not forgive. I do not forgive my son. I do not forgive his friends. I do not forgive anyone who looked at me bleeding on the floor and chose greed over love. Blood does not excuse crime. Family does not excuse betrayal. And no amount of begging can erase the truth of what he did. I ask that justice be served without leniency. For if we excuse such things in the name of motherhood, we condemn every mother to suffer in silence." A gasp rippled through the room, and I felt the weight of my words settle over everyone like a stone. But I did not waver, because it was the truth. My truth. The truth I had carried from the moment I dragged myself across the floor for the phone. Michael collapsed back into his seat, his face buried in his hands, sobs shaking his body. And though a part of me, some tiny ember of maternal instinct, longed to reach for him, I extinguished it because the fire of justice burned brighter,
And I knew that if I faltered now, everything I had endured would mean nothing. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. The sentences were read, years in prison for Michael and his accomplices. And though my heart broke into 1,000 pieces hearing my son's name tied forever to the word convicted, I also felt a strange and terrible relief because justice, at last, had spoken. And I had chosen to stand with it. As I left the courtroom, the reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, asking if I felt regret, if I felt sorrow, if I felt pride. And I turned to them, my face lined with age and pain, but lifted with dignity, and I said, I feel truth, and that is enough. And with that, I walked out into the gray morning, my cane tapping against the stone, my heart heavy but unbowed, knowing that I had given the world my answer. Justice before blood, dignity before betrayal, truth before lies.
When the courthouse doors closed behind me and the echo of the gavel faded into memory, I stepped out into the world no longer as the woman who had been shot, robbed, and betrayed, but as someone reborn through fire, scarred yet unbroken, carrying within me both the weight of a mother's grief and the strength of a survivor who refused to bow to silence. And as the cool wind brushed my face that morning, I realized that my story was no longer about what had been taken from me, but about what I had reclaimed: my dignity, my voice, my power. The mansion I returned to bore the scars of violence. Drawers still splintered, walls still cracked from the rage of greedy hands, floors that still whispered with the memory of my blood seeping into them. And yet, as I walked through those halls, with my cane tapping steadily against the marble, I no longer felt the emptiness of victimhood, but the solid presence of resilience. Because every room that had once been violated by betrayal was now a testament to survival. Neighbors came with their hushed condolences, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that they could never have sent their own child to prison, that I was too harsh, too cold. But I did not flinch, because those people had not lain on the floor gasping for breath while the son they had raised looted their soul. Those people had not felt a bullet tear through their leg while the one who pulled the trigger turned away without remorse. And until they had, they could not speak of forgiveness to me. I poured myself into recovery with the same discipline that had once carried me through medical school, waking early to practice walking, pushing through the pain of physical therapy, refusing to let my body wither in weakness. And with every step I regained, I felt not just my muscles strengthening, but my spirit hardening into something diamond sharp. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not just the house, with its broken locks and shattered glass, but my very sense of life, my understanding of what family means, because I realized that blood alone does not define kinship, that loyalty, love, and respect are the true threads that weave family together, and in that realization, I found a strange peace. I established a fund, drawn from the wealth that my son had once coveted, dedicated to women over 65 who suffered financial or emotional abuse at the hands of their families, because I knew I was not alone. I knew there were countless grandmothers, countless mothers, living in silence, ashamed to admit that the children they loved had become their greatest tormentors. And I wanted them to see that silence was not their only choice, that justice, though painful, was possible. Letters began to pour in, stories from women across the country who had endured betrayal, manipulation, theft, even violence, and each one reminded me that my wound, my scar, was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger truth, that greed can twist even the closest bonds, and that survival depends on courage, not denial. At night, I would sit in my study, the very room my son had once ransacked, and reflect on the strange duality of my life, that I had brought Michael into this world with love, raised him with hope, and yet it was I who had to take him out of freedom with justice. And though the grief of that truth will never fully leave me, neither will the knowledge that I chose correctly, that by refusing to forgive the unforgivable, I honored not only myself, but every mother who has been told to stay quiet in the name of love. I do not visit him in prison. I do not write him letters. Some call me heartless for this, but I know better. I know that sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do for a child lost to darkness is to let him face the full weight of his choices without the cushion of her pity, because only then does he stand even the slightest chance of reckoning with what he has done. My leg still aches when the weather changes, a dull reminder of that night, but I have come to see it not as a weakness, but as a scar of strength, proof that I endured and emerged standing. To those who ask me if I regret it, if I wish I had forgiven him, I answer with the same words I gave in court. I do not forgive. I cannot forgive. Forgiveness is a gift reserved for those who seek redemption, not for those who aim a gun at the very hand that fed them. And in holding firm to that truth, I have found not bitterness, but freedom. And so I leave the story with you, whoever you are, wherever you are listening, as both a warning and a promise. Beware of the blindness that love can bring. Beware of the ways greed can masquerade as family. And remember that justice, though heavy, is the only path to peace when betrayal cuts through the deepest bonds. My name is Patricia Carter. I am 71 years old, a retired doctor, a mother, a survivor. And though my son tried to steal my life, it is I who reclaimed it. It is I who now live with dignity. And it is I who will never again allow betrayal to silence me.